Shoulder flexion is a staple in most upper extremity assessments because it tells us a ton of information. But the thing is, it's only useful information if the test is performed correctly. And so that's why in this video, I want to discuss my 3 tips to optimizing your shoulder flexion assessments. So when it comes to shoulder flexion, typically we think of 180 degrees as far as the normal or desired range of motion. And as we go through the test, we have the shoulder and we go through that shoulder flexion, and we'll typically see a limitation, make note of it, and then we'll go through shoulder external rotation and then shoulder internal rotation. The thing about that is the speed in which we move through that shoulder flexion and then quickly to another test really leads us into 2 main problems. One, we start to perform this test without intent. And a direct response of that in problem number 2 is that the test then becomes unreliable. Here's the thing, to really understand the human body and to really maximize the simple tests, i.e. shoulder flexion, we need to be able to understand and recognize patterns. And if we're performing shoulder flexion in an unreliable way, in an unpurposeful way, it becomes really hard to understand what the heck is going on. And when that happens, we quickly just label things as tight and then say we need to stretch them. And ultimately, that's the short-term approach, when in reality, we want to be on that long-term game. So that's why I want to go over these 3 tips so we can get more intentional with our shoulder flexion test, but also create that reliability so then we can continue to give them the outcomes when we go to their exercise selection. Tip number 1 is starting at the bottom. Now, what I'm going to do for the video's purpose is to show you on the contralateral side. And this way I'm not blocking anything. However, in real life, the correct technique would be to do this on the ipsilateral side, right? But again, for the video's purpose, we're going to do contralateral side. That way you can see everything. Now, what is starting at the bottom? Well, how many of you can relate to this? You are going to do your shoulder flexion test. And when you're doing it, you're talking with your patient, you're building rapport with them, and essentially you're kind of just going through the motions. It's super common, right? And if you're not aware of it, check the next time you're doing it and you'll see this may be happening. What I'm referring to is we don't start at the bottom because of that rapport building, because we're talking, which as a side note is a good thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't build rapport. I definitely want you to. You just have to be aware and mindful of this. But back to our point, as we're going through this, because we're talking with them, we start at like 45 degrees of shoulder flexion. Now, the problem with that is that if this person in front of you has a significant amount of decreased shoulder flexion range of motion, and the lats are big time extending and pulling them back, we're going to essentially blow through that. So as we go through it, you're probably abducting them to give them more space. You might be internally rotating them because the lat is trying to help. But the point is, it's hard to have a reliable test if we're not starting at the bottom, right? And that unreliability is going to show when you go to choose exercises, but then that patient doesn't get better, right? So what I really strive to do is definitely build rapport, but make sure we're starting at the bottom. Again, for those that are really limited, something might show. That limitation might show at like 30 degrees of shoulder flexion, right? So think of that the next time you're performing the shoulder flexion test. Tip number 2 is monitor the rib cage. Now, how many times have you watched a shoulder flexion video and someone's talked about the rib cage? Maybe not that often, right? But here's the thing, the ribs are connected to the spine. And a lot of times we bring our patients through shoulder flexion, and as we're going through that shoulder flexion, they arch through their spine. They run out of space at the shoulder, but they're competitive and their brain knows, I need to get from point A to point B. I need to get full range of motion. So the easiest way to do that is to start to elevate the rib cage and extend the spine. So an easy way to fix this is to first ask permission to the patient if you can put your hand on their lower rib cage. So we're right over here. As you're on that lower rib cage, you're just going to depress it just a little bit, just a slight depression. We don't want to crank down. That's going to significantly limit their ability to flex through their shoulder, right? But we're going to slightly depress the rib cage. And all we're going to do is, as we're bringing them through shoulder flexion, if we start to feel this hand start to rise up, that's our cue that the test is over. They've ran out of space here at the shoulder. They're going through their spine to extend. And again, if your hand wasn't here, you would never catch that because a lot of us get really tunnel vision and look at the shoulder as well. So this gives you another reference point to anchor that down, go through that. You can still look at the shoulder, but you will get that reference of that elevation. And you know at that point that the test is then done. Tip number 3 is to avoid shoulder internal rotation. Now again, if you're not performing this with intent, these things are really subtle, but they make a big difference. Because at the end of the day, our assessment should guide our programming or exercise selection. So it's imperative that we're getting reliable results, so when we go to do exercises, they actually have the correct outcome, right? So what happens a lot of times is because of how we hold the arm or because we're not paying attention, we'll go through shoulder flexion, and usually right around 90 degrees, the patient starts to internally rotate their way up. So an easy way to do this is to hold that wrist and hold that elbow right in alignment, right? And bring them through. And the second that you start to feel that want to deviate in, you could also say out, but a lot of times patients are going to try to go in. That's technically the end of the test. They are trying to find space. They've ran out of space. And with a range of motion test, we are looking, does this person have the full space available to go through their normal range of motion? Right? So again, be cognizant. Do you feel that resistance? Are they trying to go in? If so, that's the end of the test. So I hope you found these 3 tips helpful to really optimize your shoulder flexion assessment. Now, speaking of optimization, if you really want to optimize your lower extremity assessments, your coaching, your programming, then I want to invite you to our Performance Redefined course. This is our online, self-paced, and lifetime access course where we go into a great amount of detail into these concepts and really understanding the why behind that person's pattern and how do we fix it to get the long-term solution. So I will leave that link in the description below. Feel free to check it out, and I can't wait to see you guys on the next video.